I wasn't in a good place that spring, and that sentence is still me being polite to myself. I was 43, built like a fence post from 20 years on a county road crew, practical to the point of rudeness, and embarrassed by anything that sounded mystical, superstitious, or soft around the edges. I ran graders and dump trucks. I checked culvert pitch by eye and almost always got it right. I could look at washboard and tell you where a driver had braked too hard. Then, in late January, I had a panic episode in the loader cab, with the heater rattling and sleet ticking the glass. And I called it just being tired, because I didn't have better words and didn't want any. It hit me during an ordinary shift. We were cutting runoff channels before another freeze, and I remember looking down at my gloves on the controls and thinking, these hands are steady, so why is my chest acting like I'm sprinting uphill? The cab felt too small. My vision narrowed. I popped the door, climbed down, and stood in shin-deep slush pretending I needed air for 5 straight minutes while my foreman, Nate, pretended not to notice. He gave me that kind look men in heavy jobs give each other when they are trying to protect your dignity and your paycheck in the same breath. "Take the rest of the day, Russ," he said. "We got this." I nodded like I was doing him a favor. By March, I had saved enough leave to ask for a month unpaid, and I told everyone it was for property decisions. That part was true. My mother's brother had left me a logging parcel above Cedar Fork, 12 rough acres with second-growth cedar, old skid tracks grown in, and one flat patch by the creek where somebody had camped years ago. I needed to clear brush around the boundary lines, check access, and decide whether to sell to a neighboring rancher who'd already called twice. I also needed to hide from my phone and from my own son, and that truth sat heavier than my chainsaw. Eli was 17, taller than me now, quick with math and quicker with silence when he was hurt. Our last argument had been about college visits and gas money, and my habit of turning every conversation into logistics. He wanted to talk about being scared to leave home. I answered by asking if he had updated his FAFSA password and whether his tires were still bald. He said, "You don't listen unless it's a checklist." I said something about responsibility in a tone that made the words sound like a hammer. He left my driveway with his jaw set, and we spent the next 3 weeks exchanging clipped texts about practical things neither of us cared about. I could grade roads for 20 years, keep traffic moving through freeze and thaw, and still not keep one conversation with my own family from washing out. I drove up to Cedar Fork on a grey Tuesday with my old blue Healer Mags in the passenger seat and a week's worth of canned stew rolling around in a milk crate behind us. Mags was 10, mostly grey in the muzzle, and smarter than any supervisor I ever had, including the decent ones. She liked schedules, quiet places, and sleeping where she could keep one eye on me and one on the door. She did not like towns. She tolerated people. She loved forest roads. By the time we crossed the county line, she was sitting upright, like she'd remembered her real job. The parcel sat above a bend, locals called the patient knife. Old men in Cedar Fork used that nickname without smiling, because the creek looked friendly until it wasn't. During snowmelt, it cut new channels overnight, took gravel bars apart, moved fence posts, and left alder roots hanging like wet rope. It didn't rage the way big rivers do. It worked. Slow, steady, precise. You could go to sleep with water 10 feet from your camp and wake up with it under your cot if you picked wrong ground. I knew all that, but knowing something and respecting it are not the same thing. And that month, I was low on respect for anything, including myself. I stopped at Dyer's Fuel on the way in for propane and coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. Earl Dyer, who had to be 80 and looked carved out of walnut, rang me up and watched Mags through the window while she waited in the truck. He asked where I was headed. I told him. He nodded once, then said, Snowpack came off fast this year. Creek's running odd. I said I'd keep clear. He slid the receipt across the counter and added, "Keep your ears open at night. Water tells on itself before it moves." It sounded like old country advice, and I took it as that. Camp setup was the easiest thing I did all month. I pitched my wall tent on a flat bench near the creek because it was convenient and because I was tired and because convenience has always been my favorite lie. I strung a tarp over the cook area, set my cot, split kindling, and marked 2 trees for a bear hang, even though I'd brought mostly canned food and bad coffee. Mags circled twice, chose a patch by the fire ring, and dropped down with a sigh that said, "Finally, someplace quiet." By dusk I had a tidy camp, wood stacked, tools stowed, and no excuse left for avoiding my own head. The first week settled into a routine that would have looked healthy from the outside. Up at first light, oatmeal, black coffee, work gloves still damp from yesterday. Cut brush, flag corners, note old tire ruts and possible turnout points if I ever needed equipment up there. Eat from cans over the fire. Write numbers in a notebook like I was preparing a bid. Sleep badly. Wake at 2:30 and stare at canvas shadows while the creek muttered below. I told myself the same sentence every night. I am fine. I am just tired. The sentence never got truer with repetition. Signal was spotty, but on a ridge above camp I could usually get 1 bar if I held my phone chest high and leaned left like a fool trying to improve reception through posture. My sister Claire caught me there on day 6. She had that older sibling tone that can thread love through irritation without asking permission. "Russ, you sound wrung out," she said. "You're breathing like you just hauled feed sacks uphill. Come home for a while, eat real food, talk to someone. Eli asked me if you were mad at him. I told him you were tired, but tired has an expiration date." I looked down at my boots and said, "I'm handling it." She waited, then said softly, "Handling and healing aren't the same thing." After that call, I sat on a stump for maybe an hour with the phone dead in my pocket, listening to meltwater click through rocks and wishing I could rewind 1 argument and 1 winter afternoon in a loader cab, and maybe the whole last decade, if we're being honest. I wasn't looking for signs or mystery or anything outside ordinary explanation. I was looking for a way to get through one day without flinching every time a message buzzed. The woods gave me work instead. Alder to lop, deadfall to clear, a leaning cedar to notch and drop in the right direction. Small, measurable tasks with visible endings. Mags made the place livable. She trotted ahead on the overgrown skid roads, checked in every 20 yards and gave me side-eye if I skipped lunch. In town she paced and watched every door. Up there she settled. She napped in sun patches. She watched jays with mild curiosity instead of judgment. At night, she slept hard enough to twitch her paws in dreams, probably running fence lines she hadn't seen in years. There was one evening I caught myself saying out loud, "You're doing better than me, partner." And she opened one eye like she agreed but didn't want to rub it in. There was a small, ridiculous moment around day 8 that still makes me laugh at myself. I had been arguing with a tangled fuel line for 10 minutes, muttering like the line had moral failings, when I stood up too fast and bumped my head on the tarp pole. I took 2 steps back, tipped my hat to an empty campsite, and said, "Thank you, sir, for your feedback," like I was in a county meeting and not alone in the trees with a dog as my only witness. Mags sneezed and turned away. That was fair. Late afternoons were the hardest. Work slowed. Light went amber through cedar trunks. My body got tired enough for my mind to get loud. I'd sit by the fire ring with a notebook open and write numbers I didn't need, then drift into the same loop about Eli. What if he was right that I only knew how to manage problems, not people? What if I had taught him that love comes with clipboards and deadlines? What if he learned my silence as a language and started speaking it better than I ever had? The creek below camp kept moving, patient and quiet, shaving away at the banks one grain at a time. It felt like watching a lesson I didn't want. By the second week, the weather turned in that restless spring way where mornings froze the puddles thin and afternoons turned trails to dark paste. I started tracking watermarks on alder trunks out of habit, noting where bark darkened overnight and where little side channels reappeared. The patient knife was still in its banks, but it was thinking about alternatives. You could hear it in the pitch. Less splash, more force. Even the driftwood along the inside bend had shifted higher one morning, as if nudged by a hand that never rushed. I told myself I would move camp uphill if levels rose another foot. Then I didn't. I liked being close to water, and stubbornness has always worn my face. Night came early under cedar cover, and the hours between midnight and dawn stretched long enough to hold every regret I had been dodging in town. I'd wake, hear rain tapping tarps or wind combing the tops, and wait for my pulse to settle. Some nights I got up, stirred the coals, and stood with my hands out to the heat, while Mags watched from her blanket. On one of those nights I took my phone out, opened Eli's thread, and typed 3 different messages before deleting all of them. Practical words arrived first, as always. How are your breaks? Did you get your paperwork? Call your aunt. None of it touched what mattered. So I stood there in the dark and said it quietly to the fire instead, because saying it to Flame felt easier than saying it to my son. I'm sorry I keep trying to fix you when I should just hear you. I'm sorry I keep pretending I'm steady when I'm not. The words were plain and awkward and late, but they were true. Mags got up, came over, and leaned her shoulder against my leg until the shaking in my hands eased. The creek moved below us with that careful, cutting sound, and the forest held still around the little circle of light we had made, 2 tired creatures trying to remember how to rest. The forest answered that little confession with quiet, so complete, it woke me up. I didn't mean that in a spooky way. I meant the practical kind of quiet, the kind you notice because a place you've been listening to for days stops making its ordinary sounds. Usually, even in the dark hours, Cedar Fork had layers to it. Creek talk over rock, wind rubbing cedar boughs, an owl now and then. Little scratchy movements in the duff that could have been squirrels or mice or just branches settling. That night, after I fed the fire and crawled into my bag, it was like somebody had laid a wool blanket over all of it. I opened my eyes in the tent and held my breath to check my own hearing. Nothing wrong with my ears. I could hear my pulse and Mag's breathing, slow and steady, just outside the flap. I checked my watch with the little button light cupped in my palm. 3:17 a.m. The fire had burned down low enough that only a red core showed through ash. I sat up, slid into my boots, and pushed out into damp cold that smelled like wet bark and old smoke. Mags was already sitting by the fire ring, ears relaxed, tail tapping once every few seconds like she was waiting for me to catch up to a conversation she'd been having without words. Then I saw the stones. 5 cairns, evenly spaced around the ring, each one built from smooth river rock, stacked with a mason's patience. Not random piles, not tossed, stacked. The tops came up near my shoulder when I stood beside the nearest one, and each was made from stones big enough I had to brace my knees and use both hands to test a single lower rock. Cold and slick, heavy as a truck brake drum. I knew for a fact those stacks weren't there at dusk. I'd walked that exact circle carrying kindling. I'd kicked one loose rock away from Mags's blanket so she wouldn't roll on it. I did what practical men do when practical runs out. I started collecting bad explanations. Maybe I sleepwalked. I had never sleepwalked. Maybe kids came up from town to mess with me. At 3 in the morning, 4 miles up a logging road, carrying rocks in silence, and my dog didn't bark once. Maybe frost pushed them up. Frost did many things. It did not arrange architecture. I crouched by the closest cairn and looked for tracks. The ground was cedar duff over packed soil, soft enough to hold marks if someone shuffled through with weight. I found my own boot tread from last evening and Mags's prints and not much else I could swear to. One place by the outer edge looked pressed down, broad and shallow, as if something heavy had stepped carefully and then lifted straight up without twisting. I touched the depression with my fingertips and felt foolish for doing it. Mags stood, sniffed one stack, then leaned her shoulder against my thigh and watched the trees with an easy, half-lidded look. No hackles, no whining. If she had shown 1 ounce of strain, I would have packed before sunrise and called it done. Instead, she yawned. "Okay," I whispered, because whispering felt right around work. Done that precisely. "Whoever you are, thank you for not dropping one on the tent." I heard myself say it and almost laughed. There I was, talking politely to empty timber at 3 in the morning, wearing long underwear and one boot unlaced, trying to keep manners with a mystery rock crew. I didn't sleep again. I sat on a log until dawn while the sky thinned from black to slate. As soon as there was enough light, I took photos from every angle, then put my tape measure on the ground and recorded distances between cairns in my notebook. 12 feet, 11 feet 10, 12 feet 2. Close enough to intentional that my scalp prickled, though not in fear, more like recognition. Somebody had done work in a pattern. The next day I cut brush uphill along the north boundary and kept replaying the geometry in my head. My body moved through routine: saw, drag, stack, sip coffee gone cold in the thermos. But my attention kept sliding back to camp like a compass needle. Around noon, I caught myself grinning at nothing, and that surprised me enough to stop me mid-step. I had spent weeks chewing old arguments until they tasted like metal. For a couple hours, the loop went quiet. Curiosity moved in where grief had been sitting. By late afternoon, clouds thickened and the creek tone dropped deeper, less chatter and more push. I checked alder marks again, told myself I was staying alert for water, and headed back with a bundle of split cedar on my shoulder. The cairns were still there untouched, looking almost ordinary in evening light. I cooked canned stew, fed Mags, and sat by the fire with my notebook open across my knee. At 8:42 p.m. I wrote 5 stone stacks, equal spacing, no clear tracks, dog calm. At 8:44 I wrote, could be elaborate prank. At 8:45 I crossed that line out so hard I tore the paper. Rain came after midnight, a soft, steady drizzle that ticked on top and turned the fire ring mud dark by morning. When I unzipped the tent, I got my second answer. New stones. Not more towers this time. Low runs of hand-placed rock linking 3 of the cairns in a shallow arc, each piece set edge to edge like a miniature retaining wall maybe 6 inches high. The line curved around the downstream side of camp, where sheet runoff usually threaded through in heavy rain. I stood there with my toothbrush in my mouth and stared at that arc like it might explain itself if I waited. Mags trotted over, nosed one of the linking stones, and lay down beside it as if she approved the craftsmanship. She did not guard it, just settled near it the way she settled by my tool pile when she believed work was in progress. "Don't look at me," I told her around toothpaste foam. "I can barely stack firewood straight." I spent that morning measuring again, more methodical this time. I drove 2 survey flags at fixed points by the tent and cook tarp, then measured offsets from each flag to every cairn and each end of the new arc. I sketched the whole thing in my notebook with arrows and little notes. Stone size 8 inches to 16 inches. Smooth river origin. Placement appears overnight. I took photos with a folding ruler in frame for scale. If anyone ever asked, I wanted record before memory started sanding the edges off. Around noon, I climbed to the ridge for signal and called Claire before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring. "You okay?" "I need to tell you something that sounds like I haven't slept in a week," I said. "You haven't slept in a week?" "Fair, but listen first. Somebody's been in camp at night stacking river stones around my fire ring. Precise, heavy stones. Mags is calm the whole time. This morning there were connecting lines like low rock barriers. There was a pause long enough for wind to hiss through the phone mic. Then she said, gentle but firm, "Russ, I love you, and I'm saying this straight. You're overtired, isolated, and jumpy from winter. Maybe you're seeing patterns because your brain is trying to make order out of noise. Come home, shower, eat, and sleep in a real bed. Then decide what's true." "I measured it," I said, hearing how stubborn that sounded even to me. "I know you did," she said. "You'd measure lightning if it stood still long enough. That doesn't make you wrong. It means you're scared and trying to hold on to facts. I get it." I stared out over cedar ridges and wished I could hand her my notebook through the phone. "I'm not scared exactly. I don't know, alert, and weirdly less miserable than I was." "That part matters," she said. "Just promise me if the creek rises, you move uphill immediately." "I promise." Text Eli today, not logistics, just one honest sentence. I told her I would, and I meant it. After the call, I sat on a stump with one bar flickering in and out, and heard myself think in present tense, clear as if I was saying it aloud. I told myself this couldn't be real, but real kept showing up before breakfast. I didn't have a framework that made me comfortable. I had evidence laid in stone. 2 days later, I needed propane and dog food, so I drove down to Dyer's Fuel with mud, dried to my wheel wells, and a camera card full of cans. Earl looked up from a ledger when I walked in, gave me that measuring glance old men use when they can read your week in your shoulders, and asked, "Creek treating you decent?" "It's behaving," I said. "Camp's not." He raised an eyebrow but didn't smile. "How so?" I set my coffee on the counter and kept my voice low, though the store was empty. "Every night somebody stacks stones around my site, then links them. Clean work, no noise, dog acts like it's normal." Earl stared at me for a moment, then slid my change across the glass top and said, "If the woods start arranging things for you, pay attention to direction." I waited for a chuckle that never came. "Direction to what?" "Depends what's moving," he said. "Water mostly. Sometimes you. Don't mock a gift because you don't recognize the wrapping." That was all he offered. I carried propane out to the truck, feeling half ridiculous and half steadied, like I'd been handed a tool without instructions. Back at camp that evening, I did what any man with too many questions and a road crew background would do. I set up controls. I raked smooth strips of duff in 4 places around the fire ring to catch prints. I tied a little bell from my tackle box to a cord across the obvious path between 2 cedars. I placed my headlamp and camera by the cot. Then I made dinner, scratched Mags behind the ears, and pretended not to wait for night. The bell never rang. At some point after midnight, I woke to the same padded quiet. Not total silence now, but a softened field of sound where every little forest noise seemed to lean back. I lay still, listening. There came one careful thud, then a pause, then another, each separated by enough time to suggest placement rather than movement through brush. I sat up, pulse quick but not panicked, and looked toward the tent flap where the canvas glowed faint grey with moonlight. Mags lifted her head, ears forward, then stood and stretched like she was getting up for a normal morning. She nosed the flap once and looked back at me. No tension, no warning growl, just expectancy. I opened the zipper halfway and peered out into thin mist. I could see the nearest cairn as a darker shape against the ground and, beyond it, a suggestion of bulk at the edge of firelight's reach where my coals had gone dull. Not a clear figure, more an interruption of space, high and broad, motionless for 2 heartbeats and then gone behind the nearest stand of cedar without a branch snap. I held the flap and whispered, "Sorry, didn't mean to stare," because apparently my social instincts remained active even under severe confusion. Mags stepped out, sniffed the air toward the trees, then came back and lay down with a sigh that said, "All right, that's done for now." I stayed awake until dawn again. When the light came, there were 2 new arcs of stone, one extending the previous curve and another beginning farther uphill, the start of a shallow crescent. My raked duff strips were crossed by faint compressions too broad for my boots and too clean for deer hooves. The bell still hung untouched. Whoever moved through had gone around my tripline as neatly as if they respected property boundaries. That morning, I didn't even try to argue it down to prank or accident. I brewed coffee, sat on an upturned bucket, and studied the new layout as fog burned off the creek. The pattern was widening, not closing in. Nothing boxed me in, nothing blocked my tent door, my truck, or the trail. The lines traced a suggestion, a gentle emphasis toward the slope behind camp. If this was communication, it was the most patient kind I had ever received. My grief wasn't gone. Eli was still a knot in my chest, and my own failures still lined up in memory on demand. But for the first time in months, my mind had room for something other than replay and blame. It had a problem to observe, a mystery that asked for attention without asking me to hate myself first. I checked the creek level, ate oatmeal standing up, and spent the next hour mapping stone positions on graph paper like I was planning drainage around a county culvert. Mid-morning, I climbed to Signal and sent Eli a text with no checklist in it. It took me 10 minutes to type 1 sentence and not edit it into instructions. I finally sent, "I miss talking with you, and I'm trying to get better at listening." He didn't answer right away. That stung, but it was clean pain, not the old, muddled kind. I put the phone away and went back down to camp where sunlight had reached the top stones and turned them warm gold against dark, wet earth. Mags was stretched beside the nearest cairn, paws crossed, as calm as I had seen her in years. I stood there with my notebook, my tape measure, and coffee steam in the cold morning air, and I felt a small, steadying click inside me, like a gear finally seating where it belonged. Whatever was happening around my camp was deliberate. Whatever was placing those stones knew weight, distance, and restraint, and whether I understood it yet or not, I had stopped waking each day braced for damage. I was waking, ready to notice. I stayed by the fire that night longer than made sense, feeding it 1 stick at a time and pretending I was only stretching out the warmth. The truth was, I wanted to be awake when the work started, if it started. Mags lay on her blanket with her chin on her paws, watching me with that patient look dogs get when they know your routine has slipped, and they're choosing not to make a point of it. The creek ran lower in pitch, but faster in pace, a taut sound under the cedar hush. I checked the sky every few minutes. Broken clouds, half moon, enough light to turn the wet stones silver. By midnight, my coffee was cold and my shoulders were stiff, so I banked the fire and crawled into the bag in my clothes. I left the flap partly unzipped. Sometime after 2, I woke the way you wake when a truck idles outside your house, not from noise exactly, but from presence. The little sounds had eased off again. No mouse scratch, no wing flutter, no branch clatter from restless jays. Mags was up and sitting, ears forward, tail thumping once against the ground in a slow, easy rhythm. I eased onto one elbow and looked through the gap in the flap. At first, I saw only the nearest cairn and the dim red eye of a coal. Then something moved behind the second stack, a dark shape rising where no tree had been. It stepped into the open edge of moonlight, and my whole body went still. He was enormous, not broad the way a bear can look broad at the shoulders and then narrow down, but fully built, deep chest, thick arms, long legs that bent with a kind of old athlete grace. The fur looked dark brown where shadow held it and black where light slid off it, rain damp at the tips. He had a stone in both hands, one of the larger river rocks from below camp, and he lowered it into place with both palms open and fingers spread, as careful as setting a sleeping baby into a crib. The stack didn't wobble. He held the stone for a second, feeling balance, then let go. Mag stood, stretched, and walked 3 steps out of the tent flap. She sniffed the air toward him, then sat down, relaxed as a dog waiting on breakfast. He turned his head toward her and paused. Not frozen, not startled. Just paused like he was giving her room to decide. She blinked and looked back at me, almost bored by my silence. I remember thinking in a clean, hard line. I told myself this couldn't be real, but real kept showing up before breakfast. Then another thought came right behind it. I am looking at a being tall enough to see over my truck roof, and he is handling rocks more gently than I handle coffee mugs when I'm half asleep. My pulse kicked once, strong enough to feel in my throat, but fear never took over. The distance held. He stayed outside the fire ring, outside my tarp line, outside every boundary a polite guest would avoid crossing. I pushed myself up enough that the flap rustled. His face turned toward me fully then. I couldn't make every feature from that angle, but I saw eyes catch moonlight, amber brown and steady. No baring teeth, no raised posture, no claim staked. He watched me watching him, and something unclenched in my chest, I hadn't known, was tight. Evening, I said, because there I was again, doing manners with a giant in the woods. He held still for one long breath, then bent, picked up another stone, and placed it at the end of the new run. Work first. No drama. He finished that short section, straightened, and took 3 backward steps toward the cedar line without turning his back on me. It read less like retreat and more like respect for sightlines, as if he understood that sudden close movement would force a choice neither of us wanted. Then he slipped between trunks with almost no sound at all. Branches should have shaken. They barely stirred. I sat there with my mouth open like an idiot until Mags came back and put her nose against my wrist. "You saw that," I whispered. She licked my knuckle once and circled down on her blanket. By dawn, there was a new shoulder-high cairn at the uphill end of camp, and a linked line extending toward the slope. I checked every piece like an inspector. No scrape marks from dragging, no churned earth, no boot tread, just deep, careful compressions where weight had come down straight and lifted clean. I took photos until my fingers went numb. Then I climbed to the ridge for signal and opened Eli's thread again. His reply from the day before was waiting. "Sorry, Dad, I miss talking too." I stared at that little grey bubble so long the screen dimmed. I typed, "Can we try again when I get back? I'm working on shutting up and listening." He sent back, "Yeah, let's do that." I sat on a wet log with my phone in my hand and laughed once, quiet and shaky. "All right," I said to nobody visible. 2 miracles before lunch is probably enough for one man." The next few days settled into a strange kind of companionship. I worked brush lines and flagged corners through morning and early afternoon, then came back to study whatever had appeared overnight. The stone runs grew in sections, never random, always thoughtful. Where ground dipped, the line doubled. Where runoff usually braided through, rocks were keyed in tighter with small chocks wedged under larger pieces, like somebody who understood how moving water cheats around sloppy edges. I had seen county crews do worse with machinery. I tried once to prove I was filling gaps with stress and exhaustion. I set a trail camera 10 feet up a cedar aimed across the fire ring and checked batteries twice. Next morning, the memory card held 3 empty dark frames and 1 shot of blowing mist. The camera itself had been moved 6 inches higher and re-angled toward the new stone line, as neat and level as if a surveyor had done it. No damage. Strap re-threaded through the buckle better than I had threaded it. I stared at it and said, "That's fair," because I had run out of pride to defend. Midweek, a light rain hung all day in the trees, the kind that never quite falls hard but soaks you anyway. I was splitting damp cedar under the tarp when Mags lifted her head and watched downstream. She gave 1 short huff, not alarm, just notification. I followed her gaze and saw him across the creek on the gravel bar, half veiled by willow stems. Full daylight this time. No mist to hide scale. He crouched by the bank with 1 hand on a deadfall trunk, then lifted and rolled it aside to free a blocked side channel. Water that had been backing up through brush slipped through and spread shallow instead of punching 1 deep cut. He stayed crouched, watching the flow for a few seconds, then added 2 flat rocks where the current bit at the edge. It was roadwork in its own way. Practical, intentional, no theatrics. A mule deer doe stepped out of the alder behind him with last year's fawn at her shoulder. They grazed 40 yards away and never spooked. He stood slowly so he wouldn't crowd them, moved along the bar, and disappeared into timber. The doe kept eating. I leaned on my maul handle and felt my skepticism rearrange itself. Not vanish, rearrange. The part of me that demanded measurement still measured. The part of me that distrusted stories still distrusted noise and exaggeration. But this wasn't noise. This was a pattern of care repeated over days, with engineering in it and restraint in it, and a stubborn refusal to frighten either me or my dog. That evening, Claire called when I found signal. Her voice came through with wind cracking around her end. "You still up there?" "Yeah. How are you, honestly?" I looked out over the ridge, rain lifting in slow strips from the treetops. Still sleeping rough, still tired, but clearer. I know that sounds odd. "It sounds like you," she said. "Did you text Eli again?" "Yeah," he wrote back. "We're going to talk when I get home. A real talk." She exhaled a soft, relieved sound. "Good. That's good, Russ." I hesitated, then said, "I saw him, the one doing the stones." She was quiet a beat. "You saw someone?" "Not someone from town." Another pause, longer this time. Then she said, careful and kind, "Are you safe?" "Safer than I deserve, maybe." He keeps distance. Mags trusts him. I trust her. She didn't argue. "Then keep your promises. Watch the water. Don't camp lower than you can afford." "I hear you." On the way down from the ridge, I found a small arrangement on the stump by my cook tarp. 3 white quartz pebbles I had left near the fire ring that morning out of plain curiosity, now set in a neat triangle beside a cedar sprig tied in a loose loop of grass. Not decorative exactly. A reply. I set my palm near it without touching and felt foolishly honoured. The act that settled it for me came 2 nights later when the temperature climbed and rain came warm, thick and steady from dusk on. By 10, the ground around camp had gone soft and glossy. I moved Mags's blanket under the cooktarp and drove an extra stake on the windward side. Around midnight, runoff began threading through the lower edge of camp, thin at first, then stronger. I grabbed my headlamp and stepped out to check where it was cutting. The existing stone arcs were doing what they'd been built to do, splitting the first force into two shallow flows that skirted the tent instead of crossing under it. But one gap near my woodpile was widening fast, and water started aiming straight toward Mags's spot. I dragged two loose rocks over, swore at myself for choosing this flat in the first place, and slipped in the mud hard enough to bark my shin. Headlamp beam swung wild across cedar trunks. When it settled, he was there at the edge of light, already holding a slab of granite bigger than my chest. He stepped in, still outside arm's reach, and set the slab into the gap at an angle I would have taken 10 tries to find in daylight. Water struck it, split clean, and ran away from the tarp. He added one smaller chockstone, tapped it with his palm, watched the flow, and nodded once to himself. Mags trotted over and stood by my knee, tail moving slow. He glanced at her, then at me. I was soaked through, muddy to the thigh, breathing hard from adrenaline and embarrassment. He held my gaze, then turned and walked uphill 10 yards along a faint line between the cairns. He stopped, looked back, and rested his hand on the top stone of the next marker. Not command, confirmation. I followed with the headlamp and saw what I had missed in pieces. The lines were no longer curved around camp for protection alone. They formed a narrow corridor up the slope, marker to marker, each cairn visible from the last, even in rain, each one placed where footing held better under cedar roots. The last point I could see from there sat on a granite shelf above the floodplain, dark and dry while water braided below. He waited until my light traced the whole route. Then he stepped off the path and vanished into trees. I stood in rainwater to my ankles and felt tears mix with it without warning. Not from fear, from the relief of being looked after without being judged first. I had spent years confusing strength with hardness, as if the only way to be reliable was to be unyielding. Here was strength that built shelter quietly, night after night, and never asked for credit. At first light, the rain eased to drizzle. I walked the corridor in full daylight with Mags pacing ahead, counting stones like mileposts. At the granite shelf, old debris lines told the story plain. Twigs and grass caught high in cedar roots, silt stain on boulder faces, drift bark wedged where no ordinary flow reached. High water history written in mud and wood. My convenient camp bench sat well below those marks. I turned back toward camp and saw the route clearly for what it was. Not a warning to leave the forest, a lesson in where to stand when water chose a new line. The cairns around my fire ring had been the first chapter. The uphill markers were the conclusion. Down at camp, by the tailgate of my truck, he had left another small stack of 3 flat stones on a dry patch of ground I hadn't noticed before. I set my hand beside them, then touched my chest, awkward and earnest, and not caring how it looked in the empty trees. "All right," I said softly. "I'm paying attention." I spent the rest of that morning moving what I could, without pretending I was suddenly wise. I hauled the canned food crate uphill first, then my spare fuel can, then the tool tote that always seemed 10 pounds heavier on return trips. I reset the tent stakes and tightened guy lines, but I did not move the tent to the shelf. The ground up there was solid rock with shallow pockets of soil, and I told myself one more night on the bench would be manageable now that I understood the route. That sentence was partly judgment and partly habit. Men like me keep making one more efficient decision long after efficiency has stopped being a virtue. By late afternoon, the sky flattened into one wide sheet of grey, the kind that turns distance into a smudge and makes the ridgeline disappear. The creek ran darker, slick as poured metal, and carried whole limbs past my bend without any surface fuss. I watched one cedar branch rotate once, catch, then slide free and vanish downstream. Mags watched with me, ears up, then looked back toward the first uphill marker, as if checking whether I remembered where to go. "I remember," I told her. "You keep me honest anyway." Rain started just before dusk, steady and cold at first, then warming as a southern wind slid in. I cooked under the tarp, barely tasted dinner, and laid out my boots where I could get into them fast. I put headlamp, rain shell, and keys in a dry bag by the cot. I ran my hand over Mags's back while she ate and felt the old tightness in my chest trying to build. Not panic exactly, anticipation with a memory attached to it. I sat on the cot and told myself out loud, quiet and firm, when it moves, we move uphill, no heroics, no arguing. Hearing my own voice helped. By 9:30, the rain turned heavy enough to drum on the tarp hard and blur the fire into orange smears. The first side stream appeared at the edge of camp around 10, exactly where it had during the earlier storm, and the low arcs split it clean. Water folded around the rocks and rejoined downslope like traffic using a detour somebody had flagged in advance. At 11, the creek took a new tone, less like flow over gravel and more like weight sliding under pressure. I stood in the dark with my hood up and felt that sound through my boots. At 11:47, my watch light briefly lit the nearest alder trunk, and I saw watermarks climbing in real time. Dark inches stacking where bark had been dry 10 minutes before. I stepped back toward the tent and called for Mags. She was already at the flap, alert but calm, tail low, eyes on me. Then came the first true surge, not loud, just sudden. A broad sheet of brown water curled through the downstream edge of camp, hit the outer stone line, split, and kept coming in two narrowed lanes. The diversion held, but the volume doubled within seconds. I grabbed the dry bag, shouldered the pack with the essentials I'd staged, and clipped Mags's lead, though she didn't need it. The second surge reached the fire ring and shoved ash in a grey fan across the mud. I flashed my lamp uphill and picked out cairn 1, then 2, both shining wet. Rain blew sideways now, needling my face, and every familiar shape had gone flat and uncertain except those stones. They stood where they had stood for weeks, each one exactly where a hand had placed it. I started for the corridor at a quick walk and shifted to a run when water wrapped my ankles from behind. Mags stayed at my left knee, sure-footed, no pulling. Cairn 3, then 4. The line between them was low but visible, water sheeting around it instead of across it. At 5, a new branch current cut from the right, and for one disorienting second, my light caught only rain. Then I saw him. He stood above the next marker in a soft burst of lightning, broad shoulders dark against white rain, one arm extended along the route, palm down, not pointing like an order but laying the line out again in case my fear narrowed my sight. He did not step toward me. He held position and let me choose. I chose. I drove uphill with Mags, boots slipping once, catching, slipping again, then finding the route line exactly where the stones had taught me to plant my feet. We made the shelf in less than a minute, maybe less, and when I turned back, the bench where my tent stood was already half under moving water. The tarp snapped loose on one side and flapped once before the current pinned it to the ground. My fire ring vanished. The lower woodpile rolled, bumped, and broke apart. I dropped to both knees on wet granite, one hand on Mags's collar, and pulled air that felt too thin. My whole body shook, not from cold, from the edge I had walked right up to without admitting it. Rain ran down my face and neck and into my shirt. I looked up toward where he had stood. He was on the slope below the shelf now, 20 yards out, framed by cedar trunks and rain, still as a boundary post. The same old athlete balance, knees soft, weight centered, no urgency wasted. He watched me the way someone watches a man stepping off a bad ladder rung. Ready, present, not intrusive. The creek thundered below us, and up there on the rock I heard my own voice break. "I'm tired," I said into rain and darkness, to him, to myself, to anybody listening. "I'm tired of saying I'm fine when I'm not. I'm tired of talking to my boy like he's a problem list. I'm tired of acting like hard is the same thing as strong." Words kept coming once they started. They came ugly and plain and honest. I told the storm what I had not told people. I said I had been scared since that day in the loader cab and ashamed of being scared. I said I had confused control with care for so long, I did not know how to set one down without dropping both. I said my son had asked me to listen, and I had answered with instructions because instructions were safer than love. There in the rain, I had one of those moments where thought goes present tense and sharp enough to cut through years. I am kneeling on a rock, while floodwater takes the campsite I picked for convenience. I am alive because someone kept working while I slept. I am being shown in stone and patience that power can be careful. I wanted the world to be simpler than this. I wanted to believe only what fit in my old toolbox. But this is real. This is real, and real is kinder than I gave it credit for. Mags leaned hard into my side and let out a long breath. I wrapped both arms around her neck and cried into her wet fur until my throat hurt. Not pretty crying, shoulder shaking, teeth clenched, years late crying that leaves you emptied and steadier at the same time. Through it, he remained where he was, not approaching, not leaving, giving me room to come apart without being alone. When the worst of it passed, I sat back on my heels and wiped rain and tears with the same muddy sleeve. "Thank you," I said. It was too small for what I meant, but it was true. He lowered his arm. He inclined his head once, almost like acknowledging a completed task, then turned and moved along the tree line. Even in that rain, his steps were deliberate and quiet, each placement certain. At one point, lightning lit him broadside, and I saw his hand brush the top of a cairn as he passed, not for support, more like a final check on work he had already trusted. Then cedar and rain closed around him, and he was gone from sight. I stayed on that shelf through the worst of the night, with Mags curled against me under the emergency blanket from my pack. The rain came in waves until near dawn, then eased by degrees. In the grey hour before full light, the creek still ran high and mean-looking, but the main surge had passed. Debris rattled along the edge of the bench where my camp had been. 2 times I stood and almost climbed down out of impatience, and 2 times Mags planted herself in front of me and refused to move. She was right, both times. When first light finally spread enough to read the ground, I descended slowly, picking each step between wet roots and stone markers now half sunk in run-off silt. The camp was scoured but standing. The tent had shifted 2 feet and lost 1 stake. The cooktarp was torn on one corner. My fire ring was full of gravel and bark fragments, but the sleeping area had not flooded through, and the truck sat where I'd left it, mud splashed high, tires intact. The low arcs had broken the first force just as designed. They had bought me time, then the corridor had done the rest. Near the last marker before camp, I found deep prints in a patch of fresh silt, clearer than any I had seen. Heel, midfoot, long forefoot, toe impressions rounded and wide. Each print sat where footing was firm, no wasted movement. I knelt beside one and laid my spread hand inside it. My hand looked like a child's mitten in a dinner plate. By the truck, the little stack of 3 flat stones was still there on the dry patch, untouched by floodwater. I crouched and touched the top one with 2 fingers. It was cool and smooth and ordinary in the hand, which somehow made it matter more. I spent the morning packing in a slow, deliberate way, not from fatigue, but from respect. I wrung out the tarp, rolled the wet tent, checked every tool twice, and loaded the truck heavier in front for the muddy descent. I kept pausing to look up toward the shelf, then down at the bench, reading the difference in elevation with the humility I should have had from day one. Around 10, sun broke through in narrow bars and lit steam rising from the soaked duff. Jays returned first, then squirrel chatter. The forest resumed its ordinary language as if night had been one difficult sentence and morning had moved to the next line. Before I left, I took 1 flat stone from the stack by the truck and climbed back to the granite shelf. Mags came with me, slower now, shaking water from her coat every few steps. At the shelf edge, I set the stone down beside the highest cairn and added 1 smaller pebble on top, my own clumsy imitation of patience. For the work, I said. For the warning. For not giving up on me when I kept missing it. I kept the 2nd flat stone in my coat pocket. I left the 3rd where it had been. The drive down the logging road took 40 careful minutes. Mud pulled at the tires, and twice I had to ease around fresh washouts where the edge had slumped overnight. At Dyer's Fuel, I parked under a dripping fir and went inside for coffee and a minute of dry heat. Earl looked up, took 1 look at my clothes, and reached for a towel before I asked. "Creek moved," he said. It did. He set the towel and coffee on the counter. "You moved first?" "Not fast enough on my own." His eyes rested on me, steady and unreadable. "But you moved." I nodded. "I had help." He tipped his chin once, like that settled it. "Then pass it on." I stood there with steam rising off my sleeves and said, "How?" "Listen better than you lecture," he said. "Same as with water." Outside, I sat in the truck with coffee between my palms and looked at Eli's thread. My thumb hovered longer than I liked. Then I hit call. He answered on the 4th ring, voice cautious. "Hey." "Hey, bud." A pause. I heard a door close on his end and the scrape of a chair. "Everything okay?" "Yes and no, I'm safe. I'm headed home." My throat tightened and I let it. "Can I ask for something?" "Okay." "Can you give me 10 minutes when I get there where I just listen? No fixing, no checklist. I'm not saying I'll do it perfect, but I want to do it right." Silence long enough for me to hear my own breathing again. Then softer, "Yeah, we can do that." "I mean it, Eli." "I know," he said, and there was strain in it, and hope too. "Drive safe." I drove straight home, not to the county yard, not to another job site, not to anywhere I could hide in tasks. Claire was at my place by the time I pulled in, standing on the porch with a grocery bag and that no-nonsense stance she had inherited from our mother. She hugged me once, hard, then held me at arm's length. "You look like flood debris." Accurate. She stepped aside so I could get Mags in and dry. "He'll be here at 6, she said. I told him I'd cook and disappear. At 6:10, Eli came through the door in a hooded sweatshirt, taller than me by a little now, hair too long over his forehead. He looked older than 17 and younger than I remembered at the same time. We stood in the kitchen not knowing the choreography. Then he set his keys down and said, "You said 10 minutes." I did. We sat at the table with Claire's casserole untouched between us and steam fogging the window over the sink. I folded my hands so I wouldn't interrupt. "Talk," I said. He talked. about being scared to leave home and feeling stupid for being scared, about thinking I only approved of him when he had a plan, about how every conversation with me felt like a performance review he hadn't prepared for, about wanting a dad, not a foreman. Twice I opened my mouth on reflex and closed it again. I nodded, asked one clarifying question when I got lost, and listened until his voice shook and steadied and shook again. When he finished, he stared at the table and said, "I don't know if that made sense." "It made sense," I said. "All of it." I swallowed and kept going without hiding behind practical words. "I'm sorry. You were right. I've been managing you instead of hearing you. I was scared and I made that your burden." He looked up then, eyes wet but direct. "You never say stuff like that." "I know. I'm learning late." He gave a short, surprised laugh that broke the tension by exactly the right amount. "You always were stubborn." "Occupational hazard." We both smiled, small and tired and real. Then we ate casserole at the table while Mags lay under Eli's chair with her head on his boot, as if this had been her plan all along. 2 days later, I went back to work and asked Nate for lighter equipment duty for a while. He looked relieved I had asked. "You good to run Water Watch with me this week?" he said. "No heroics, just eyes and calls." "Perfect," I said. That Saturday, Eli came with me up to the parcel in clear weather. I had told him I wanted to show him where to camp safely if he ever went without me. We parked high and hiked down with Mags bouncing between us. At the bench, I showed him the silt line, the shifted tent stakes I had left as markers, and the way the old camp flat sat in a natural catch basin. Then I walked him up the stone corridor, marker by marker, and let him read it with his own practical mind. At the shelf, he turned slowly, taking in the elevation, the channel angles, the way runoff would split below. "So whoever built this knew hydrology," he said, half joking. "Better than I did." He crouched by the top cairn where I had left my return stone and ran his fingers over the smooth face. "You really saw him?" "I did." He studied me for a long moment, measuring not the claim, but the man making it. "Were you scared?" "Not the way you mean. I was overwhelmed, then grateful." I looked out over Cedar and Creek and said the truest sentence I had for him. "I learned there are kinds of strength that don't shove. I want to be that kind with you." He nodded once and set a small pine cone beside the cairn like an offering he didn't need explained. We moved my future campsite to a flat patch just below the shelf, where 2 firs broke wind and drainage ran clean. We dug a shallow sump, set a proper stone ring, and stacked wood under a lean-to frame high enough to stay dry in spring storms. Eli measured distances while I held the tape this time. At one point he grinned and said, "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Letting me lead." I laughed. Don't get used to total freedom. I still have opinions about knots. By evening we sat on the new camp stools, eating beans warmed over a careful fire, with Mags between us and the creek sounding busy but far enough away to be background, not threat. The old bench below was visible through cedar trunks, greener already where flood silt had spread. Life moved back in fast when given room. I still carry that flat stone in my coat pocket some days, especially on mornings when the old habits creep in and I want to answer people with instructions instead of attention. The edges have warmed smooth from my thumb over months. If somebody asked for a scientific explanation, I could list what I know and what I don't. I know the creek rose where it had risen before. I know stone lines can redirect first force runoff if placed right. I know the corridor to high ground was built before I understood why I needed it. I know my dog trusted what she saw long before I trusted myself. I know an enormous, watchful being shared that watershed with us and chose kindness as method. I don't need the rest solved to live differently. I call Eli to hear his voice, not just his plans. When he says he's stressed, I ask one question and wait for the answer. Claire still checks on me, but her tone has less edge and more ease. On hard nights when my chest starts to tighten and old panic scripts try to spool up, I step outside, feel the ground under my boots, and picture wet stones gleaming in rain, each one placed in patient sequence toward safer ground. What I carried up to Cedar Fork was shame, fatigue, and a belief that survival meant clenching harder than the next problem. What I carried down was simpler and stronger. Pay attention, move when the water changes, and treat the people you love like they are not obstacles to manage, but lives to stand beside. The patient knife still cuts new channels every spring. It always will. But I no longer mistake unpredictability for malice. Sometimes the world warns you in the language of care. Sometimes it keeps showing up before breakfast until you finally listen.